One of the things that often makes people think that preservation is so annoying and hard to do is because they're doing the wrong things in the wrong order.
What if the buildings we construct today could solve the problems of tomorrow? Welcome to the Passive House podcast, where we explore the ideas, people, and practices transforming the way we build. Brought to you by Passive House Accelerator and the Reimagined Buildings Collective. Join a growing movement of builders, designers, and changemakers leveling up their practice and building the networks they need to thrive. Find free resources at passivehouseaccelerator.com and take it further inside the Reimagined Buildings Collective, our members-only community built for people serious about healthy, climate-ready buildings.
Hello and welcome to the Passive House podcast. I'm Zach Semke coming to you from Seattle, Washington, and I have Jay Fox here. Jay, how's it going?
Fantastic. I'm down in Asheville, North Carolina, and it is a little rainy, but summer's in full swing. My tomatoes and eggplants are doing well, so I'm okay.
Nice. Yeah, we're enjoying some nice weather. We finally got through January in Seattle, so July is treating us well. It's been good, no complaints. Well, we have a great interview that you conducted with Nakita Reed, one of my favorite people in this movement and her new role. But before we get to that, we want to thank some folks who make all of our work possible here at Passive House Accelerator, including here at the Passive House podcast. So a big thank you to 475 High Performance Building Supply for being our sponsor of the week and making everything possible here for us. And thank you also to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Ingui Architecture, Partel, Rockwell North America, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Cascadia Windows and Doors, DuraPanel, Icon Windows and Doors, Intis Windows, LG Air Conditioning Technologies, Proseco, Source 2050, and Zender. So, Jay, tell me about how you got connected with Nakita and maybe introduce folks a little bit to her before we dive in.
Sure. I actually don't remember how this came about exactly. I think I was looking into her to maybe help with an article, or I think maybe I was interested in some project that Quinn Evans had done. And I noticed that she had a new role, which I am actually going to read this from paper because it's so long. But her new role is Senior Director for Preservation Operations at the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. And I was like, well, that sounds cool. So I reached out to her, I think just on LinkedIn, and saw if she wanted to take part in the podcast, just because, she's done. I think I first met her maybe 3 years ago when she did an article for the Accelerator, and she's just one of the best people to talk to when it comes to, that kind of intersection of sustainability and preservation. And, as she mentions in the podcast, she's been doing this work for a long time, and she's just always a great person to just pick her brain and see what she has to say.
Yeah, no kidding. If folks who've been to our Reimagined Buildings conferences will recognize Nakita. She's featured in a number of them and just really dynamic speaker and thinker and very poetic in her presentations as well. She has her own podcast that you mentioned, Tangible Remnants, and also is a leader of the Zero Net Carbon Coalition, ZNCC. And I also noticed a few months ago that she had made the shift from Quinn Evans. So I have been eager to learn more about her new role. So it was a real treat to be able to hear the two of you dive into that and hear about how she is kind of applying her sensibilities around sustainability and preservation and historic preservation, especially African American history in that role. So with that, let's dive in.
Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm your co-host, Jay Fox. Today, I'm joined by Nakita Reed, Senior Director for Preservation Operations at the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. Nakita, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You got it. I think we'll just kick off right away. A lot of our podcast listeners and fans of the Accelerator are familiar with your work. They've seen you for couple of years. You've been, I guess, on a few, conferences and podcasts and other things. So this is a new role for you. So I'd like to know what what's this new role like and what drew you to the organization?
Yeah. So it is very different from what I was doing because I am taking a step back from traditional architecture practice.
Mhm.
And now I am at the National Trust for Historic Preservation within the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund division. Long name, I know, but the work is impactful. And so one of the things that drew me to the organization, it's actually a little bit of a return because I did actually intern at the National Trust during grad school like 15 plus years ago. And I
Mhm.
was actually one of the first sustainability interns at the National Trust, back when the National Trust for Historic Preservation was delving deeper into climate and making that connection between historic preservation and climate action. And so it was actually great to be able to come back within this new role and capacity to be able to bring all of the experience that I've gained in the past 15, 20 years to bring it back to this division. And so in my new role, about 50% of my time is spent on internal operations within the Action Fund, and then another 25% on strategic partnerships. And
Okay.
then kind of the remaining is on preservation education. So a lot of it is really helping people understand what they're able to do with their historic buildings. What does it mean in terms of easements or other types of preservation protections, as well as really helping people, both building owners as well as architects, understand how to navigate the process. Because there's still a lot of people who, they think that, oh, if we sign the architecture contract or if we get awarded this grant, then we start construction tomorrow. And that's not at all how it works.
Yeah.
So that's great to be able to create frameworks and provide some resources. And then it's also fun because within my role, I also get to interface with a lot of fantastic team members who are grant makers. And so we have a lot of team members within our grants team because
Mhm.
part of the fund is really making sure that we are funding projects to be able to get a lot of the work done.
Very cool. And are you focused on a specific region within the United States, or is it pretty much, anywhere?
Nope, it's nationwide, and I would say the theme is more of the focus, and so around projects centered around African American heritage, but definitely nationwide. And so some of the grant projects and grant initiatives that we have include conserving Black modernism and really working with projects to do more research on highlighting Black architects and Black modernist architects who designed impactful modernist buildings, because unfortunately the architectural canon excludes a lot of those or a lot of those designers and architects
Mhm.
just because there hadn't been a focus there. And so the Action Fund's been funding projects and working in collaboration with the Getty to be able to elaborate and expand their Keeping It Modern program. So we're really telling more of the story of modernism, which has been fascinating. There's also the Historic Black Churches grant program, where we're actually helping to fund different historic churches. And then even the descendant and family-led stewardship projects. So there are a number of projects around the country, even thinking of like Monticello or Montpelier,
Mhm.
where the descendants of everyone who lived on the site, both enslaved and slaver, their descendants being able to be in conversation to talk about stewardship of the project and of the sites going forward.
It's really cool.
Yeah,
And yeah, sorry to keep harping on location, but like, is
no, it's
is
okay.
is there a lot of like rural work that you do, or I won't say rural, but like smaller towns and not focus so much on like your big cities where you'd think, when you say Black modernist, I would immediately think Chicago, Detroit, New York, like the northern cities
Yes.
where Exodus kind of went to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of our stewardship or key stewardship projects is actually Nina Simone's childhood home in Tryon, North Carolina.
Like
It
20
was,
minutes away.
oh, really? That's
Yeah.
amazing. And so you should go visit if you haven't yet. But
I
it's a fascinating, it was, a three-room building that the fund was able to work with a number of architects and collaborators to be able to restore it and steward it so that that piece of history and basically that site of being able to tell Nina Simone's legacy
Mhm.
doesn't get lost. And so a lot of the fund does focus on how do we help people learn more about the vernacular buildings, so the banal buildings, the mundane ones that aren't the high architectural grand style, but still have a fantastic historic story to tell, and
Mhm.
also are important to be able to tell more of the full American story. Because a lot of the buildings that most of us interact with are not just going to be the high style architecture buildings, but a lot of really important things have happened in a lot of those mundane looking buildings as well.
Yeah. No, now I'm thinking I went to Atlanta and was, walking around the whole area that's like dedicated to MLK and just like,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of the buildings are just kind of like you would walk by them 1,000 times and not really think anything of it. And that's really what,
Hmm.
that's what you interact with most of the time.
Yeah.
You're dealing with obviously like a lot of different project types and eras and conditions. And what does it actually look like from a technical perspective to manage a portfolio, of this enormous size?
Yeah. So one of the things that's been interesting for me personally, as I've taken on this role, is that I am much more removed from the drawings, if you will. So
Okay.
it's more so I'm talking to the architects who are doing the work as opposed to being the architect doing the work. And then even working with those architects to help understand process, problem solving, and then also working with the team to help fill in when needed. So whether it's a site visit or needing to help kind of be a sounding board for the architect and contractor as they're running into unforeseen conditions on site, or even trying to figure out really where did a project stall or what is the next step to be able to help them meet the requirements to fulfill their grant responsibilities. So it's been a little bit of managing all of the different things that come up, but it's been fun being on this side where it's less stressful in the day to day and
Yeah.
much more advisory. So I've been enjoying that piece of it.
When you're dealing with these project teams, when they hit kind of snags, like what are some of the major pain points and how do you end up resolving
Mhm.
that?
Yeah. So sometimes it is helping to make sure that the building owner and the design team aren't talking past each other
Mm.
and that both sides are understanding the grant requirements. Because sometimes there is a misperception about what's needed to be done to be able to fulfill the requirements of the grant. So sometimes it's really just kind of language communication, making sure we're all on the same page.
Mhm.
Sometimes it is being able to help them think through when they're talking to the State Historic Preservation Office or the SHPO, if they're having any issues with the building permit or kind of the requirements between any sort of historic preservation or building requirements. So a lot of it's helping them troubleshoot and trying to kind of see what's the real issue.
Yeah.
And is it a timing thing? Is it a needing more conversation thing? Is it a everyone needs to kind of just get into the same space and look at the problem together and a little bit less telephone? Because sometimes that happens too, where there's too many side conversations happening to really be able to solve the issue when if everyone just got on the same call or into the same place, there could be one conversation that would really streamline the decision-making process.
Okay. That I feel like that sounds like a Mike Ingui kind of like recommendation. Like everybody just get together and talk and it gets solved.
Right. I mean, he knows what he's talking about. Does it make sense?
Yeah, he's done this a few times.
Right, exactly.
But one of the threads that runs through all of your work is the question of whose history gets preserved and whose doesn't. And the Action Fund exists precisely because African American heritage sites have been systematically undervalued and underfunded. How does that equity lens inform your work now as an advocate for preservation and high performance building?
Our former executive director of the Action Fund, now current CEO of the trust,
Mhm.
um, he was able to realize that there really was a miseducation of the American public around who's been here, whose history matters, and he really sees preservation as a way to empower the American public and re-educate really to help people understand that we've all been here since the country was founded many times before. And there are many layers to history, but because unfortunately, preservation has really been focused on rich white men, there's been a lack of understanding of whose history matters. And so the Action Fund really seeks to help reframe, recenter, and expand the narrative, not erase, because there's plenty of space for all of us to exist.
Yeah.
And by telling the fuller story, that doesn't change anything that happened. It just makes sure that the current generations and future generations actually have more of the full truth as opposed to the cherry picking side of it.
Mhm.
One of the things that has been fascinating for me operating at the intersection of preservation and sustainability, though, is that a lot of times people still think that it's an either or instead of a both and. And
Mhm.
so we absolutely can make historic buildings sustainable and being able to have that conversation to help people understand the process for how that can work, how these two things work together, and the fact that building reuse really is climate action. And being able to also help people who traditionally have been excluded or undervalued or underfunded for a lot of projects, helping them understand both preservation and sustainability and how those go together is something that I'm just so excited to be able to do at the Action Fund. But quick tangent, one of the things that I love about this work as well is all of the stories and things that I'm still learning about. One of the trips we went on recently was to Colorado we were sponsored by History Colorado to go learn more about the Black experience in Colorado. And I had never thought much about the Black experience in Colorado. I was like, oh, is that a thing? It very much is a thing. But me being from East Coast, I hadn't really thought so much West. But one of the nuggets from the trip that really blew my mind was the fact that I had never thought about the fact that there were enslaved people working in the gold mines because the white slavers brought their slaves out to go dig in the mines. I also hadn't thought about the fact that there were freed Black folks also working in the gold mines during the gold rush. And so kind of those stories, as well as even learning more about the Buffalo Soldiers and the indigenous populations and how those stories layered together. It was just a reminder to me for the work that we're doing and how we're working and telling these stories, amplifying these stories, and really highlighting a lot of the work that's happening all over the country, but being able to shed more light on them. So that's one of the recent examples of some of the fun things I'm doing.
Sounds so cool. I was a history major in college, and yeah, I
Nice.
did. I think one of my favorite courses, I did Native American history
Mm.
and read,
Hmm.
what's it called? Facing East from Indian Country. And it was just like basically turning American history on its head, and uh,
Yeah.
at least the one that you're taught in high school. And it's
Yes.
such an interesting perspective, and there's all these amazing stories, and obviously read like Howard Zinn's People's History, and there's just like,
Right.
you know,
Yeah. And it's so needed because it's so much of it is forgotten or purposefully obfuscated or concealed,
yeah.
hidden even. So, I mean, even with this current administration trying to, you know, change the narrative and what's taught and what's shown in museums. So just being able to do work that's really seeking the facts, the truth being at the basis of the work that's being presented has been exciting.
Mhm.
And the vacuum of leadership that's existing around preservation at the federal level, the state and local level preservation organizations are stepping up. And so, and even like national organizations like the National Trust, which by the way is not a federal agency, it is an advocacy organization, nonprofit, not an agency. But there's been a lot of reinvigoration around how do we keep doing the work that we're doing in a way that's still going to be of most use to the American people.
Speaking of local preservation boards, I mean, they have something of a reputation, at least in New York, where it's for being difficult, and for specifically people with, doing retrofits. There can sometimes be some friction there. So for listeners who are not familiar with what that tension kind of looks like, can you just kind of explore why it comes up and why it can oftentimes be difficult to resolve?
Yes. And so I have heard many times historical commissions be referred to as the hysterical commissions because they are the boards that homeowners or building owners have to interact with when they're trying to paint their building or add solar panels or do any sort of exterior changes if their buildings are located in certain historic districts. I will say a lot of times it does depend on who the commissioners are, what their qualifications are. There have been times when I've had to present to commissions and explain the preservation law to some of the commissioners because they were appointed to the commission because they knew the mayor or sold someone a car. Like sometimes it just depends on who's on the commission and needing them to know that, yes, there actually are guidelines that need to be followed. The Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. And so a lot of times there is this frustration around what seems to be common sense versus what is preservation law and what needs to be followed. I will say that there are a lot of commissioners that are doing fantastic work and really doing the best that they can to make sure that the areas and the buildings and communities that we care about are protected and will retain their character defining features.
Mhm.
But there is also sometimes politics and local politics that get involved. So that's where some of the tension comes from as well, particularly if it seems like the developer, the building owners who are coming in trying to make changes are not trying to adhere to preservation guidelines or don't care about the history or the site. So a lot of it comes down to perception, intention, and really the plan and how prepared you are to talk about the work that you want to do.
Okay, that's great advice. And I want to ask specifically about windows because that is literally like every time I'm ever writing about,
Mm-hmm.
retrofit. And again, this is largely in New York City, but I think it's come up in Boston too. Every time I'm talking about a historic retrofit, windows is an issue. So, what are
Understand.
is there any advice you can give to designers in general terms to help with the window question?
Yes, and the window question is always going to be there. And it's kind of a twofold thing. One, if you have historic wood windows, you absolutely want to repair them instead of replace them, particularly if they're the old growth windows that have been there for over 100 years,
Mhm.
because those types of windows can be repaired. You can reglaze them, you can do epoxy, you can do some, mill some new wood to replace some broken pieces. And then you can use interior or exterior storm windows to improve any sort of efficiency.
Hmm.
I've also seen some instances where sometimes the wood window or like the muttons can be accommodated, or I guess adjusted to accommodate a thicker glazing unit of glass. And so sometimes that's allowed. I know that New York in particular, they also do allow some windows to be swapped out, particularly for the tilt turn triple glazed windows, which are windows that look like they're double hung, but they're actually tilt turned, which is
Yeah.
amazing. Other SHPOs, other states don't allow that. I've tried having conversations with other SHPOs to be like, hey, but New York lets this happen. Why can it happen here? Hasn't necessarily been bought in just yet.
Mhm.
But often the reason why there is a desire to not change the windows, particularly if you have the historic wood windows in place, is because it is going to change the character defining features of the building and it's going to look different.
Yeah.
Another thing that people often forget, vinyl windows, the new windows that have the insulated glazing units, all of that, those are replacement windows. Right in the name, it tells you you're going to have to replace these windows, typically in 20 to 25 years.
Mhm.
So a lot of times people who aren't thinking of the financial longevity of the windows and kind of being stewards of it for a longer term, they'll think that, oh, if I can just replace the wood windows with vinyl windows, it's faster, it's cheaper, I can, get this done faster. But they're not thinking about the fact that you're going to have to redo that big window project again in
Yeah.
2 decades. Or if the IGU fails and gets foggy, you're going to have to replace it again. So they're also not, you can't replace pieces of replacement windows. You have to replace the entire thing. And so even from a sustainability standpoint, being able to replace broken panes of glass or broken pieces of wood is much more sustainable than having to throw the entire thing away. So there is that argument as well. But replacement windows, I know are always a hot topic in the preservation circles and even in the sustainability circles, because it does make sense that windows and air sealing, air tightness, being able to have windows that aren't drafty, it makes a difference to how your building performs.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there, again, I'm sorry that my like general knowledge is so New York centric. I really need to
Okay.
learn more cities, but I feel like they've gotten a little bit less strict if it's like not the like street facing facade.
Hmm.
And so
Yes.
again, I'm thinking of I think it's 3 Arts in particular.
Yes.
They were allowed like a little bit of leeway. Are other jurisdictions kind of following suit, or is that like just a New York thing?
Yeah. No, that's kind of just a general preservation thing, that typically the primary facade is the facade that needs to have the most care given to it when it comes to changing any of the character defining features.
Mhm.
But secondary and tertiary facades, you typically have much more leeway. So for instance, if you're trying to do an addition, doing the addition on the back of the building instead of the front of the building is typically going to get through better. Punching new openings or adding doors or that sort of thing. If it's not necessarily visible from the street, that's typically helpful. Even things like adding solar panels to the roofs. A lot of times, as long as the solar panels would not be able to be visible from the primary street facade,
Mhm.
then you're able to do a lot of that. Of course, you want to make sure that your roof structure can handle the weight and all the other things that come along with adding solar panels to a building. But Also, since we are talking high performance, it's also important to note that solar panels are not where you start when you're trying to make your building more high performing. It's definitely more of the air sealing and insulation and all of those things before you get to kind of adding on the renewables.
Nice. And that actually brings up the next question, which is, again, this is 3 arts, but there was another project in Chicago I heard about, or like Rockland or something. Is it Rockville? Anyway, somewhere in Illinois, where they needed to boost the insulation, but the interior is protected and the exterior is protected. And like, what if that happens? Is there any advice that you can give that can help, boost the performance of the building and the wall assembly overall?
Yeah, that is tricky when both the interior and the exterior are protected. Air sealing comes to mind, but when it comes, and I'm also just trying to think through from an insulation standpoint. I mean, even if you're going after historic tax credits, which typically has purview over the interior and the exterior, there typically is some leeway to provide insulation on areas of the building where you're not going to be destroying too much of the historic fabric.
Yeah.
I would say in rooms where there's like complex wood molding or really ornate cornices, chair rails, that sort of thing, those rooms likely would want to remain untouched just so that you didn't have to destroy a lot of the historic fabric to insulate. But it's tricky. And it also depends on the type of building, because even when you're adding insulation into a historic building, being mindful of the dew point on the walls so that you know where you're insulating so you're not introducing mold, and just kind of really being mindful of the building science of it all.
Mhm.
And it's not impossible, but you just have to do it thoughtfully and intentionally. But in cases where internal and external are protected, I would say air sealing might be your best bet. Air sealing, paying attention to making sure your windows are, as tight as they can be, but unfortunately there's going to be some loss to the walls. Also, you could look at probably doing insulation in the roof, at least to providing some of it. So even with retrofit projects that have some of these historic protections, there is this back and forth of what makes sense, what doesn't make sense.
Mhm.
And a lot of times the intervention that you're going to do in the building is going to depend on what's the historic protection on the building. How is the building funded? Because for instance, if you're doing all of your work with private funds and you're not in a local historic district that has an easement or anything like that, you have much more flexibility with what you can do to your building than if you're using any state or federal money.
Which makes sense. I mean, that they kind of hold that as the carrot and the stick to make sure you actually,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. And then so moving on to like mechanical strategies, what typically works in a historic project? I mean, is it easier to have a centralized system that minimizes facade penetrations, or are there ways to build decentralized systems that rely on?
Oh, PTAPs? Yeah, so a lot of it is going to depend on the use of the building. I've worked on some projects where it did make sense to do a new DOAS central system and kind of do the big unit on top of the building, because it was a multi-story building where the DOAS unit wasn't going to be visible from the street.
Mhm.
I've done other buildings where kind of doing a low velocity system where there's kind of more of like the little holes in the floor that have the flexible ducts that are connecting to them makes more sense. So it's going to depend a little bit more on the use. But a lot of times, whenever you're having to add new mechanical systems into the historic building, it's always good to look at where there are already existing openings. So for instance, could an old fireplace or coal chute or something like that become a place where some ducts could go, so that you're not having to make new penetrations wherever possible. And then in locations where you are having to make new penetrations, making sure that you're doing them in places where you're not blowing through really ornate historic details. And so really just kind of being intentional. There's often the running joke that the plumbers will come in and just cut through whatever they want to do.
Yep.
Like, oh, there's a joist there, doesn't matter. I need to put my pipe there. Or, the electricians come in and do different things. So it's really just as you're working on these projects, bringing a level of intentionality to them that's going to really think about the historic fabric and how the systems need to run through the building in a way that's not going to destroy the historic fabric.
Great. And I mean, would you, this is going back to the Mike Ingui, kind of like get everybody on the same page together. Like, so,
Yep.
I mean, when would you, I mean, just from the earliest stage, just get a consultant to come in who's like a historic preservation consultant to kind of help plan this?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. If you're working with a contractor who has never done a historic property before, definitely make sure you have a historic architect or someone who can even serve as the preservation consultant to the contractor. I've served in that role before where the firm I was with didn't do the actual architectural drawings, but the contractor hired us to be able to consult with during construction for when questions came up or when unforeseen conditions came up, because they always do once
Yeah.
you open up a wall and you see what's behind it. And you're like, oh, that's actually not, that doesn't exist the way that the architect thought it would. Or, someone 60 years ago decided to put X, Y, and Z in the wall. Now we got to take it out and figure out what to put back. So a lot of it is just making sure you have the professionals on board.
Mhm.
Also making sure that you recognize, or you being the building owner, whoever, that the time that you're putting up front to have the preservation professional engaged is going to save you money and also de-risk your project, instead of just trying to say, well, Jim Bob said he can do it and he said it would cost me $5 and he can do it by tomorrow. And then you don't pass inspection, or then you have issues with the historic commission. So really understanding the building from the preservation side is
Mhm.
going to save you time, money, headaches, stress, all
So
of it.
yeah, but like what? Like I mean, what are some of the problems you've seen just like when you open up, you have no idea what's going to be behind this wall. You open it up and you're like, "Oh crap, we didn't expect that." Like what are some of the common problems you kind of see when that happens?
Yeah. So let's see. Sometimes structure is not where you think it's going to be when you open up a wall.
Okay.
And then that means that, okay, you have to reconfigure a wall, a layout, something like that. Sometimes you'll open up a wall and there are, for instance, in a lot of buildings kind of built in the early 1900s, interior downspouts and gutters was a very common way to build buildings. And
Really?
the downside of that, of course, particularly when buildings are left vacant for many years, and there's no thermal control. So there's buildings are freezing and thawing, those pipes burst on the inside. And so then a lot of times you'll see just busted plaster or pipes at corners of buildings or along the cornices, because those pipes, or because the downspouts and the gutters have frozen over, burst, that sort of thing. Sometimes when you think there is going to be a chute, there's not. Or sometimes when you are opening up, I'm trying to think of other ones. Like also, like there have been some projects I've done where we've needed to add elevators or secondary stairs.
Mhm.
And so kind of cutting through floors and finding different things, or finding different members or structural members being more rotten than expected because there was water damage or a fire at some point in time that had gotten repaired somehow, or repaired, covered over, and so the evidence wasn't as clear. And then once you
Yeah.
kind of start making those alterations, and you have to recalibrate.
I mean, is there any way to kind of yeah, what's like the sorry, I'm just so ignorant of how this all works,
No
but
worries.
how do you kind of research the history of a building? Like say again, a single family home that's in Tryon,
Hmm.
Carolina.
Yep.
Who knows what's happened to it? It was built in like 1890, not like a mansion or anything. Like, how do you
Right.
learn about the history of that building? Like the structural.
Yeah. So yes. So I will give my Cliff Notes version, and any historians who are listening, bear with me. But because I usually work with a lot of historians when we are doing building research.
Hmm.
But a lot of times it's looking at Sanborn maps. And so those are typically the maps that were done by the fire insurance companies. Also searching through newspapers just to see if there's any sort of notable events that happened or any news that happened and that got reported on. For
Hmm.
instance, one of the projects that I was working on in Jackson, Mississippi, our historian did research and found that the second floor of the building was actually added in like 1945. And that helped us realize, okay, so that's why what we're seeing in terms of the building systems is a little bit different, or that's where some of these changes likely came from. Because a lot of times when you're working on a historic building, there's a lot of changes that happened over time. And sometimes you need to get a better understanding of when certain changes happened. Newspaper articles can also be helpful to understanding if there was a fire, if there was some sort of flooding event, if there was anything that happened like that. Also, historic photos can be really helpful. So if there was any sort of event that happened near your building in history, that you can kind of search photos to see if there are any documentation from what could have existed at a certain time, that can be helpful. There's also deed searches, property searches to see who owned the building at what point in time. Because sometimes it's really interesting to be able to find a building that was owned by someone or even designed by a certain architect, and then see what other types of buildings that architect or that firm also designed to see if there are any similarities. So it's a little bit of a puzzle being able to kind of check a lot of different resources just to learn what you can about the building. And a lot of times all of that is put into something called a historic structures report. There's kind of lots of guidelines from the National Park Service on what that looks like. It is actually a really helpful document that is done by preservation professionals to be able to provide information about the building and the resource to the building owner, and then also provides all of the sources where the information was found, and really becomes a great document for the building owner going forward.
That's so cool. It's like if I knew that job existed when I was 22, that's probably what I would have gotten. Because I was
Fair.
a title searcher in New York for 10 years, and my favorite projects were, there's a church on, somewhere on the Lower East Side. It's a Catholic church. We have no idea when it was founded or anything. You need
Yep.
the original deed. And it would be so, some of these deeds that were pulled were from, before the country was founded.
Hmm.
It's just, yeah, very, very.
Exactly. That's so cool.
All right. Sorry, getting into the nerddom here.
All good.
All
All
back.
good. I love it.
All right, cool. So for a practitioner who's listening and they're about to start their first historic retrofit project, can you provide them with any practical advice about, what they should do to approach it? What are some of the biggest mistakes, and what, I don't know, just what do you wish somebody knew before they kind of like set out to do their first project?
Yes, I love this question so much, because one of the things that often makes people hate doing adaptive reuse projects or think that preservation is so annoying and hard to do is because they're doing the wrong things in the wrong order.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that I would want everyone to do if they're starting to work on any building that they're pretty sure is historic is, one, confirm that it is historic, double check the historic protections. And I say that because not every old building is a historic building. Old buildings only become historic intentionally once they are listed in either a national register listing individually, or in a district listing, or at the local and state level. But checking the preservation protections is super important. Most states have a state historic preservation office that has an online resource where you can typically type in the address or go and check to see if your building is listed there, and it'll tell you the historic protections on it. Because if your building is listed on the national register versus a local register, there are just different requirements that you have to deal with. Typically, buildings that are listed on the local register have more stringent requirements that they have to work through than buildings that are listed on the national register. That's often, people think it's the other way around, but
Yeah.
it's not. The way to think about it is that the local jurisdictions have more oversight and authority because they're dealing with a smaller geographical area than things that are on the national register. The other thing for architects to think about as they are working on a project is to really understand from your client, how are they funding the project? Because if your client is using state or federal funds, then the preservation protections will be a little bit different. Case in point, if your client has a building that is listed on the National Register, it is not in a local historic district, but they are funding it 100% by themselves, they can do whatever they want to that building. A lot of people tear buildings down because a preservation protection does not prevent you from tearing down your building in most cases. Now, I'm a preservation architect. I am not advocating for people to tear down their buildings or to destroy any of their historic fabric just because they can. But I think that, or rather just because they potentially could be able to. But I think it's just important for the design team, the building owners, to really understand the intersection between the preservation protection as well as the funding on their buildings. The other thing I would say, starting early and talking to your state historic preservation officer, particularly if your client is going after or wants to pursue historic tax credits or even low-income housing tax credits where there might be an intersection. The state historic preservation officers, they are resources for building owners. They are not just there to, they're not just the teachers where you turn in your assignment and get a grade at the end. They want to be engaged throughout the project. You will absolutely have a better time and a smoother process if you talk to your SHPO before you submit for your building permit. The number of architects who I've talked to who don't talk to their SHPO until after they have their building permit in hand. And then they are very frustrated because now they have all these preservation protections that they didn't realize they had to deal with. It's just they didn't follow the process. And so being able to know the right steps in the right order will definitely save people a lot of headache.
I'm not remembering the curve, but it's the later in a process that you try to fix something, the more expensive and difficult it becomes.
So much more. And particularly when it comes to like preservation regulations and compliance, the time that it takes to correct things, particularly if you have to like go before the Preservation Review Board, they have agendas that get set a month in advance. So you have to make sure you get your documents in, however much in advance to get on the agenda. If you don't, then you get pushed to the next agenda. So time gets more expansive if you're not following the right process. And then that also gets expensive.
Okay, well, that's good advice. Um, all right, cool. So between the Action Fund, the Zero Net Carbon Collaboration, Tangible Remnants, and your own design practice, I assume you have a better understanding of how the relationship between historic preservation and high performance building is evolving. Is there a future where deep energy retrofits of historic buildings become routine rather than exceptional? And what needs to happen to finally get us there?
I definitely think there's a future where energy retrofits are much more routine than exceptional in historic buildings. There's been a lot of great work happening through the Built Buildings Lab, Climate Heritage Network, and actually I will send you a link, I'll put it in the chat for, there's a fantastic toolkit out now called Decarbonizing the Built Environment that the Climate Heritage Network is putting out. So really providing more toolkits and resources to help people understand and really have resources to be able to do this work. I think for so long there had been siloed work happening. So like the preservation professionals who were focused on sustainability were doing something separate from kind of the architects who were focused on sustainability. And so there's really been much more of a silo breaking, particularly with Climate Heritage Network, as well as the ZNCC, and having more of these conversations. And so I think the more that we're able to help building owners, because honestly, they're the ones who are making the decisions about what to do with their buildings.
Yeah.
But the more that we can help them understand that preservation and sustainability are two sides of the same coin, as opposed to two separate coins, is going to continue to help push us forward. I will also say like the building codes and things like that are starting to also incorporate more existing building language. And also I'm thinking of Sean Denniston just did a great or wrapped up a great project on the building energy performance standards, which are coming out regulations for a number of different states and cities that is going to start requiring existing and older buildings to benchmark and hit more performance targets. And so I think this blending of code and building standards and seeking to do continual upgrades to buildings is going to push the built environment to be more high performing, as opposed to trying to say that, oh, well, if it's historic or if it's existing, it just gets excluded from having to be high performing, because that doesn't need to be the case.
No, not at all. Well, that is, I think, a fantastic place to end here. Nakita, this was such a great conversation, and I stand by what I said. If I had known more about this at the age of 22, this probably would have been where I went in my career, because it's just like very interesting.
Well, if you ever get tired at PHA, there's probably space for you. Just saying, it's never too late.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Okay, so that was a great interview with Nakita Reed by Jay. And Jay, I don't want you to get any ideas about moving from PHA to historic preservation. I'm sure it's very interesting, but come on.
It is, of course. I'm not going anywhere. But if I was 22, like I said, I mean, yeah, my old job back when I was a title searcher, rotting away in the basement of 60 Center Street, and have the coolest things that I would get to do is find these old churches, and it was like, you'd know it as St. Paul's, but it was initially St. Paul the Evangelist, and then before that it was actually St. Mary's of the, Immaculate Conception, whatever. And you would have to trace it back, and you'd be going through these deeds that are like, they had to formally change the name on paper, and you'd be reading it like it's from like 1816, and you're like, crap, this got like burnt a little bit, so I can't see the full name, and then you go, and it was just like, just because I was a historian by trade, or by, I guess, education, and that I just thought that was like the most fun thing, and find out that there are people doing that, going through these old records. It's so cool.
I really enjoyed that part of the interview. I thought it was super interesting to hear all the different ways that she was there, all the different kind of angles to try to unearth what has been going on with the building, and going through newspapers. And yeah, our house, we have an old 1905 house, and when we did our energy audit, it was useful that the former owners had some photographic there's some like photographic history of the building. So we have from early in the century, and then kind of mid-century, and then more recent, to be able to see like it's definitely gone through these transitions. And it helped in that context to like think about where to hone in terms of looking at, all right, is it working here, and what's going on? And yeah, so that was super interesting. What were some other what were some highlights for you?
I mean, she gave the Michael advice, which I did call out, which is just get everybody on board as early as possible. And I mention this curve every once in a while, and I looked it up because I keep forgetting the name, but it's the McLeamy curve, or the cost influence curve, which is
Yeah,
just like, you do the earlier you get in and make changes, the cheaper it's going to be. So just even if there's an upfront cost for getting a consultant, they're ultimately going to save you money. So just please, for the love of God, do that.
right.
I just I think that's great advice that people need to hear, especially for some of these like bigger multifamily projects that are, have huge budgets to begin with.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I was, one of the things that I really kind of drawn to when Nikita is talking about sustainability and historic preservation is her conviction that it's both and rather than either or. And and of course that's not, I guess it's, from one perspective it's always the case, because there is this argument that preserving any existing structure is inherently a carbon can be a carbon smart approach. There are obviously there's some edge cases that where I think it may be either or, but the both and is just, I think, such an important kind of framing for all sorts of questions around climate action in buildings and elsewhere. And so I really appreciate that that's where she's at, and that she's, playing a role, I think, in helping make that true. Yeah, there were these little pieces where she mentioned, like, hey, New York City is doing these simulated double hung, high performance windows. What about you guys? And
Yeah.
like there's a just having the knowledge she has as a passive house trained professional, an architect, to bring to the table, I think is helpful. And I also thought it was important to get the reminder from her that not every old building is a historic building. And so
Yes.
I think we can get maybe a little bit hung up if we're coming from like, oh, the building has to perform, it needs to be, that we need to slash its operational carbon emissions. We can get a little bit hung up with that, but it's useful to understand that it's a fairly small number of buildings where there are really, really onerous restrictions on, like both, like you guys were talking about the both the interior and the exterior being something you can't really touch. Like that's your hands are a little bit tied. And Nikita mentioned, airtightness is one approach, but still, even the window, the windows are going to be leaky still. So, but there are so many historic buildings or old buildings that don't have those kinds of restrictions, that if you're using your private dollars to make them happen, or to make the retrofit happen, that you can be more creative and different, approach the building differently. So that both and then the reminder that, hey, let's step back and think about kind of the scale of old buildings, that where you can come up with solutions that might not be approved for the most kind of restricted historic buildings. Means there's a whole spectrum there to play with, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's, I kept bringing up Three Arts because I don't know, it's just on my brain. I reread the article or something. God knows what happened.
Yeah.
But Three Arts is a big exception because that's like this when it was built, it was like a luxury, amazing building. It was like the absolute most, perfect example of 1927 New York City architecture on both the interior and exterior. And like most places, yeah, aren't going to be like that. So I think that's a good reminder too. Like it is pretty rare that you're going to run into like such extreme restrictions. It's going to be something of, a federal building in DC or like a super historic building in New York. But most of the buildings we interact with, you don't have to, walk that line.
Yeah, and another thing that occurred to me when listening was that sometimes the historic research that goes into like, okay, what was this building and what happened to this building, what was it originally, can unearth kind of prior conditions that are conducive to energy performance. So I'm thinking about Reuben Hall and hearing Cecil and the team talk about that from NYU talk about the when they discovered this old historic photo of the building, the window profile was different than it was than they found it, than it was like prior retrofit, right? Like a few years ago. And that window profile was better suited for a good high performance retrofit solution with simulated, in this case, simulated double hung windows. I think that kind of the rigor of kind of really understanding the building can pay dividends, not just in terms of having historical integrity, but also performance integrity.
Yeah. And I'm just saying, so I don't remember Ruben's. I should say I went to NYU, so I was like 2 blocks from Ruben, where I first moved in, which was Brittany Hall on East 10th and Broadway, and the windows were like it's like iron iron paned monstrosities that you open a handle and then open it up. You could not put an air conditioner there. You couldn't put anything there. It just
Right.
like opened up
Yeah.
to the sky. So there were bugs flying in. There was no air conditioning at all. And it's like, I don't even understand how you could simulate that as a high performance window. Like you were just,
Mm-hmm.
if it's the same, trying to solve that problem with the same kind of general window, that would have been so hard. So I'm really glad that they got a better configuration that was more conducive to like a simulated double hung.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, really great conversation. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add before we wrap up here.
I did want to add, I mentioned the book Facing East from Indian Country during the interview, and that is by, sorry, I had to look this up, Daniel K. Richter. It was published in 2001, and it was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for History. I highly recommend folks read that if you want some light, sad reading over the summer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is really good, and it's just I love talking history, so it was cool that I got to do that. But I wanted to make mention of that because that was a very formative book for me that I came across during college. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I'll check it out. Maybe we can have an excerpt for our summer reading club. This is my segue. The summer reading club inside the Reimagined Buildings Collective.
Perfect segue in.
So, as many listeners may know, Passive House Accelerator Live, which our series that happens on Wednesdays, takes a hiatus in July and August. So we're on break for that. But things are humming inside the Reimagined Buildings Collective. We are in the midst of Reimagine Summer, and the 3 key pieces of Reimagine Summer are our summer reading club, where we every 2 weeks dive into some cool articles about typically building decarbonization and resilience that are recommended to us. So articles and podcasts that are recommended to us by the experts who are presenting as part of our summer sessions. So we have summer sessions by a bunch of leading experts every Tuesday. It's like a summer school for building nerds. So we're in the midst of that. And then we're also in the midst of our summer labs, our summer Reimagine labs. So lots of fun stuff happening inside the collective, and we'll be kind of producing work that will be shared out in September and October and on in the fall from that. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can head over to reimaginebuildings.com to find out what the collective is about. This has been great. And we miss Matthew today, but he'll be back next episode. So thanks for listening to the Passive House podcast, and we'll see you next time.